There are moments in the deep history of our species when the universe seemed to lean close and whisper a single, merciless question. Do you truly deserve to exist? 74,000 years ago, that question was asked not by a god, not by fate, but by the Earth itself, through the detonation of the Toba supervolcano. No human alive at that time could have understood the scale of what was unfolding. To them, it might have begun as a distant tremor, a strange trembling underfoot, the animals around them lifting their heads with unease. Then came the sound, an impossible, expanding roar that rolled across horizons like the sky had cracked open. In a way, it had. When Toba erupted, it did not simply release ash, it rewrote the atmosphere. A column of incandescent material blasted upward with the force of billions of tons of TNT, punching into the stratosphere and spreading outward in a ring of catastrophe. Within hours, daylight dimmed. Within days, the world had entered a twilight that would last years. Imagine standing there, watching the sun fade not because of clouds, but because the very air had turned into a veil of volcanic dust. The sky would have shifted into strange colors, brown, yellow, bruised violet. Birds disoriented, falling from the air. Rivers turning gray with ash. A silence descending after the explosion, so vast and unnatural that even the wind seemed afraid to return. Then came the cold. With sunlight blocked, temperatures plummeted with a speed no ecosystem could withstand. Grasses died, forests withered. The great animals that humans depended on grew weak, diseased, skeletal. Hunters followed tracks that ended abruptly in lifeless bodies. Food supplies shrank from dangerously low to almost non-existent. Lakes froze at the edges, rain turned acidic, carcasses outnumbered living things, and scattered across this dying landscape were humans, small, vulnerable, and utterly unprepared. Genetic evidence today suggests that our entire species may have been reduced to as few as 1 to 3,000 breeding individuals. That number is not poetic exaggeration. It is the size of a modern small village. One epidemic, one migration gone wrong, one brutal winter could have finished us permanently. The fact that our species survived at all borders on statistical defiance. But survival in that time did not look like triumph. It looked like desperation. Bands of early humans huddled in caves, their fires weak and wavering. Ash seeped into their lungs, causing infections they had no medicine to treat. Their tools dulled faster than they could replace them. Water turned toxic unless filtered through layers of sand and charcoal. Infants died with heartbreaking frequency. And yet, against all sense, they kept moving, one starving step at a time through a world turning colder and quieter. What kept them alive was not strength. It was something far stranger. Adaptability under terror. The eruption created a pressure chamber for the human mind. Forced to the brink, our ancestors began inventing new strategies, better tool edges, more efficient sharing of food, more coordinated hunts, more complex communication. Catastrophe was sculpting intelligence. Still, no invention could grant certainty. Every sunrise, if the dim glow could even be called that, was a question. Would there be food today? Would predators find them? Would the air finally clear, or would the cold deepen further? This was not just the worst time to be human. It was a moment when being human at all seemed like a mistake the universe was trying to erase. And yet, the fragile spark of our species endured, trembling, flickering, but unextinguished. For thousands of years after the Toba eruption, humanity lived inside a narrowing corridor of possibility, a genetic choke point so severe that the future of our species depended on the survival of a handful of scattered families. They did not know they were walking along the edge of extinction, but every breath they took, every fire they kept alive, every child who survived another night contributed to a statistical miracle. In the dim world left behind by Toba, survival demanded more than instinct. It demanded transformation. The cold sharpened everything: the air, the hunger, the fear. Early humans learned to anticipate danger with a precision that bordered on clairvoyance. They studied the ash-frosted ground for the faintest traces of animal movement, searching not just for prey, but for patterns, routes that herds might follow, migrations that might offer one final chance at meat before a long stretch of starvation. They became interpreters of silence, readers of wind, analysts of shifting seasons. Harshness itself was the teacher. For the first time in history, survival did not belong to the strongest body, but to the most adaptive mind. Groups that clung to old habits vanished quickly. Those that experimented with new tools, new tactics, new social structures gained the slightest advantage: the difference between life and death. It was during this era, researchers believe, that humans refined the shaping of stone blades, developed longer-reaching weapons, and began coordinating hunts with a level of planning previously unseen in any primate. But beyond tools, something more profound changed: the architecture of human cooperation. Before Toba, small bands of humans may have existed mostly independent of one another, but disaster forced a new logic. When resources shrank, when prey migrated unpredictably, when the world grew colder than their bodies could endure, groups had to share information or perish. A rumor of a distant freshwater spring, a gesture warning of predators nearby, a shared piece of dried meat. These exchanges built fragile webs of trust that stretched across the wounded landscape. And within these webs, something remarkable happened. Ideas began to travel. A method of preserving food invented by one band would appear generations later, hundreds of kilometers away. A clever design for binding stone to a wooden shaft spread across territories, not through conquest, but through whispered demonstration beside a flickering fire. Knowledge became a currency more valuable than any material object. It carried no weight, but it could save entire lineages. This was the dawn of culture, born not from leisure, but from suffering. Yet even with growing intelligence and cooperation, extinction hovered close. There were nights when the cold deepened without warning, when the stars shimmered through an atmosphere so thin and brittle that sound itself felt muted. Fires sputtered. Hunters returned empty-handed. Children cried with hunger until they no longer had the strength to cry. The threat of death was not an event. It was an environment. And then there were the predators. The collapse of ecosystems drove great beasts into desperation. Massive hyenas, towering cats with serrated fangs, packs of wolves hardened by hunger. They prowled the perimeters of human camps, studying the movements of these frail, fire-dependent primates. More than once, a single misstep in the night meant the loss of a hunter, a mother, a child. Humans were not yet the masters of the world. They were competitors, sometimes prey, in a brutal contest for survival. But even predators could not anticipate what was forming in the human mind. Fear became strategy. Strategy became invention. Invention became dominance. Step by step, fire by fire, idea by idea, humans clawed their way through the bottleneck, and as generations passed, the world slowly loosened its grip. Ash settled, plants returned, rivers cleared, the cold receded by fractions. survival became a little less impossible. One day, though no one marked the moment, the number of humans crossed the threshold where extinction was no longer imminent. The species had endured. But the memory of that long darkness, that near erasure, stayed within us. Not in stories, those came later, but in our genes, our fears, our ancient instincts. It shaped what humanity would become. We were a species born not from triumph, but from catastrophe, and stronger because of it. Long after the ash clouds of Toba faded and the sky regained a trembling hint of blue, Earth delivered yet another trial, one colder, slower, and in many ways more merciless. It was not an explosion this time, not a sudden scream from the planet's core, but a gradual suffocation of warmth. The sun still rose, but its rays felt weak, distant, as if the star itself had grown weary of the world it illuminated. Ice advanced, not as frost or seasonal snow, but as vast, moving continents of frozen time. Glaciers crept across the land with a patience only the earth could possess, silent, relentless, grinding mountains into dust. Entire valleys disappeared beneath walls of ice hundreds of meters thick. Rivers froze into rigid scars. Forests shuddered under the growing cold, their leaves dying first in pale whispers, then in sweeping waves that left behind skeletal groves. Humans had survived the volcanic winter, but now they faced a new kind of darkness. A world that no longer welcomed warmth, life, or permanence. The cold was not simply an absence of heat, it was a presence, a force that crept into bone and thought. It shaped behavior, migration, and even biology. Lips cracked until they bled, extremities numbed quickly, then dangerously. A night without fire meant death not by violence or starvation, but by the quiet, dreamlike descent of hypothermia. Fires became sacred, shelters became fortresses against the wind. Movement became a calculus of energy, risk, and hope. In the vastness of this frozen world, humans sought refuge where they could. Some followed coastal lines where the sea remained liquid and thin pockets of warmth lingered in salt-laden breezes. Others moved toward valleys shielded by mountains or huddled in caves where geothermal heat softened the bite of winter. It was in these caves that some of the earliest traces of symbolic human thought emerged. On cold nights, when wind screamed outside like an ancient spirit angry at the persistence of life, humans painted. Charcoal, ochre, and crushed minerals became stories on stone, depictions of animals they hunted, dangers they feared, dreams they once had, or forces they could not name. The cold may have reduced their world, but it expanded their minds. Still, the ice showed no mercy. Food grew scarce as prey animals retreated or perished. Mammoths and woolly rhinos, though adapted to the cold, migrated unpredictably, forcing human groups to travel farther and longer in desperate pursuit. Every migration was a gamble. Chase the herds too late, and starvation followed. Chase them too early, and the cold would swallow the unprepared. The world had become a frozen maze, one that shifted unpredictably with seasons that stretched into years. The predators of this age were terrifying in their adaptation. Giant hyenas with bone-crushing jaws prowled the open plains. Enormous cave lions chased mammoth calves across the snow, their roars echoing against icy cliffs. Dire wolves moved in, coordinated packs, watching the movements of human groups with unsettling intelligence. Humans were no longer prey by default, but they were certainly not rulers. Every firelit night was shadowed by eyes watching from the dark. Yet humanity endured, not because they were the strongest species, but because they were the only species that could rewrite their own weaknesses. The cold forced innovation faster than comfort ever could. Clothing of layered hides replaced simple wraps. Spears lengthened and balanced for both thrusting and throwing. Camps became more structured, with wind barriers built from bone, stone, and packed snow. Most importantly, humans became wanderers not by accident, but by design. To survive meant to move. To move meant to learn the land. To learn the land meant to predict it, bend to it, and sometimes defy it. In the frozen quiet of the early Ice Age, something essential crystallized in the human spirit. A refusal to surrender, even when the world itself seemed determined to erase them. In a world locked beneath ice, survival ceased to be a daily task and instead became a lifelong pilgrimage. Humans no longer lived in a familiar landscape. They lived in a shifting puzzle of frozen rivers, migrating herds, and storms that rose over the horizon like advancing armies. Every step was calculated. Every decision carried weight, for in such a world, the cost of a mistake was not discomfort, but disappearance. Hunger shaped the rhythm of existence. Meat was everything: energy, warmth, hope. A single successful hunt could give a band of humans another week of life. A failed hunt could doom them entirely. They learned to read the land with a forensic attention to detail. A broken twig, a patch of disturbed snow, a faint indentation beneath frost. These became clues in an ongoing investigation into the movements of prey. The mammoths left wide, rumbling tracks across the plains, but following them was a challenge. The herds moved slowly, steadily, sometimes unpredictably, driven by forces humans could only sense through the thin language of instinct. Hunters studied their behavior for years, understanding the animals' rest cycles, migration routes, and weaknesses. Despite the danger, mammoths represented nourishment on a scale unmatched by any other creature. Life condensed into towering, shaggy forms. But hunting such giants required something new: precision cooperation. A lone hunter had no chance. The disorganized group was doomed. Only coordinated minds could bring down coordinated muscle. Over generations, humans learned to plan with a subtlety that had never before existed. They positioned themselves along migration paths. They used the terrain, steep cliffs, narrow passes, frozen lakes, as silent allies. They communicated through gestures and soft clicks, optimizing silence. Slowly, this coordination rewired their intelligence. The Ice Age was not just sculpting bodies, it was sculpting brains. And even so, success was rare. More often, the hunters returned empty-handed, faces hollow, furs stiff with frost, breathing the thin air of resignation. These were the nights when the fires burned weak and children fell asleep with aching stomachs. In such moments, humans realized something profound. Food could not be relied upon to come from the familiar. So they explored. Farther and farther they pushed, leaving behind territories their ancestors had known for generations. They crossed frozen rivers, followed coastlines, slipped through icy passes between mountains that groaned under the pressure of expanding glaciers. Every migration brought them into unknown lands, some barren, some rich, all dangerous. But with danger came discovery. Along coasts, they found sustenance in the ocean: slick fish darting beneath the ice, cold-stunned seals resting on stones, shellfish clinging stubbornly to rock. For the first time, humans shifted from a life dictated solely by land to one shaped by water. The sea became a dark mirror, unpredictable and threatening, but also a provider when the land refused to feed them. As their world expanded, so did their stories. Nights were no longer spent merely recounting the day's struggles. They spoke of distant lands, of animals larger than memory, of shimmering lights in the northern sky that danced like spirits awakening. These stories did more than entertain. They preserved information. Embedded within tales of monsters and heroes were lessons, where rivers flooded, where predators hunted, where food could still be found when winter turned merciless. This was the era when memory became humanity's first map. But even memory could not protect them from the predators who saw humans as an easy meal. Dire wolves watched the migration patterns just as humans watched the herds. Massive cave lions stalked the edges of torchlight. Hyenas, bold from hunger, approached camps with uncanny patience. Predators that once dominated the land now competed with humans for survival. And humans, though increasingly clever, were far from safe. A single misstep could undo months of endurance. A hunter slipping on ice, a child wandering too far at dusk, a camp placed on the wrong side of the wind. Survival remained a fragile negotiation. And yet, through this ceaseless struggle, humans became something new. Creatures not defined by their environment, but by their ability to rewrite the rules of that environment. Slowly, painfully, relentlessly, they pushed outward. Every migration extended the reach of the species. Every shared story expanded their collective memory. Every invention, no matter how crude or small, became a brick in the foundation of future civilization. They did not know it, but their frost-bitten steps were carrying humanity toward a destiny no other creature on Earth would ever claim. The Ice Age was not simply shaping their survival, it was shaping their identity. And long after the glaciers retreated, the memory of this cold, relentless journey would remain buried in their bones, a silent reminder of the price humanity paid to continue existing. Long before humans walked the earth alone, we shared the world with shadows of ourselves, other species of the genus Homo, each shaped by its own journey through evolution. The planet once thrummed with their footsteps. Homo erectus, long-striding wanderers who left Africa nearly 2 million years ago. The sturdy Neanderthals who thrived in the cold lands of Europe, the elusive Denisovans hidden in the mountains of Asia, and tiny, mysterious island dwellers like Homo floresiensis, whose small stature belied a complex intelligence. But by the time early Homo sapiens began to spread across continents, these branches of our evolutionary family tree were withering. Their disappearance is a riddle written in bone fragments and ancient sediments, a mystery that whispers through the genome of modern humans. The world they inhabited was harsh, shifting, and unforgiving. Climate swings carved away their territories. Expanding glaciers buried entire hunting grounds. Forests turned to grasslands, and grasslands turned to desert. For species already adapted to narrow ecological niches, even small environmental changes could destabilize their lives. Neanderthals, for example, were built for strength, not endurance. They hunted large animals in ambush attacks, relying on close-quarter power rather than long pursuit. When prey herds shifted or disappeared, their strategies faltered. Meanwhile, Homo erectus endured for an astonishingly long time, longer than any other human species, but gradual environmental decline eroded their last havens. The Denisovans, enigmatic as they remain, occupied high-altitude regions where even slight climate fluctuations could cascade into catastrophe. Yet, environment alone cannot explain their vanishing. Into this unstable world came Homo sapiens, carrying not just tools but ideas, ways of thinking that allowed them to adapt more quickly than any species before them. It wasn't dominance in strength, it was dominance in flexibility. Where other hominins specialized, sapiens improvised. They shifted hunting strategies, modified tools, formed larger social networks, and explored new territories instead of clinging to old ones. This adaptability made Homo sapiens a silent force of disruption. But the encounters between sapiens and their cousins were not one-sided battles. Archaeological evidence paints a quieter, more haunting picture. Cooperation, curiosity, shared shelter, and interbreeding. We carry the proof in our DNA. Neanderthal markers lie folded inside the genomes of non-African peoples. Denisovan signatures remain in the peoples of Melanesia and parts of Asia. Their bloodline did not disappear. It merged with ours, an ancient echo that breathes beneath our modern skin. Yet, despite genetic blending, the distinct species themselves vanished. The reasons remain elusive. Competition for resources, disease exchanged between populations, climate-driven collapses, perhaps even conflict. A world stressed by cold, scarcity, and shifting ecosystems could not support so many similar species forever. And the species best able to adapt, best able to change, became the one that endured. Imagine the last Neanderthals living in shrinking refuges, watching unfamiliar humans move through their lands with strange tools and larger networks of cooperation. Imagine the final Denisovans retreating deeper into mountain caves as warming and cooling cycles reshaped their world. Imagine the last of Homo floresiensis on their isolated island, their tiny fires flickering beneath an indifferent sky. They were not failures of evolution. They were casualties of a world that demanded more flexibility than their biology allowed. And yet, their disappearance is not a story of extinction alone. It is a story of absorption, of inheritance, of silent ancestors walking with us even now. Their genes shaped our immunity, our physiology, perhaps even our minds. But at the time, none of this was visible. To the early sapiens migrating across continents, the world simply seemed to be emptying of its familiar figures. Valleys, once rich with life, became quiet. Caves that once echoed with voices fell silent. The land was changing, and the shadows of humanity's siblings faded, one by one. The question that lingers is not why they vanished, but why we did not. Across the shifting continents of the Paleolithic world, the last remaining branches of the human family were fading, one by one. But their disappearance was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet erosion of possibilities, while Homo sapiens, fragile, hungry, unremarkable in strength, continued to spread. The question that echoes through evolutionary history is simple, unsettling, and difficult. Why us? The answer lies buried in patterns too subtle for bone alone to reveal, printed instead in behavior, cognition, and the invisible architecture of social life. To begin, Homo sapiens possessed a remarkable advantage: adaptability without specialization. Where Neanderthals had bodies tailored for cold environments and close-range hunting, sapiens had bodies that were simply capable. Not exceptional, not refined, but able to function across an astonishing range of climates. Adaptability was our species' greatest trait, not mastery of one environment, but the ability to endure many. This flexibility extended far beyond physiology. It shaped the mind. Ancient humans developed a capacity for planning several steps ahead, a skill born from living in a world where misjudging the future meant starvation. They crafted tools not only for immediate use, but for scenarios that had not yet occurred. They imagined outcomes. They anticipated uncertainty. This ability to model possibilities inside the mind, an internal simulation of the world, allowed them to adjust strategies rapidly as conditions changed. Other hominins planned, but sapiens planned differently, more abstractly, more collaboratively. Their social networks stretched farther. A Neanderthal group likely numbered a few dozen. A sapiens group could create alliances spanning multiple bands. Information, resources, and genetic diversity flowed through these networks like unseen rivers. In a changing environment, this was survival's most powerful currency. It meant that a famine in one valley did not necessarily doom a lineage. It meant knowledge discovered in one shelter could spread before it was lost. It meant ideas, those fragile sparks, had a better chance of catching fire. And then there was language. While other hominins certainly communicated, sapiens developed a refinement of speech that allowed complex ideas to be carried across time and distance. A warning could be conveyed with nuance. A hunting tactic could be taught with precision. A memory could become a lesson. Over generations, this ability compounded, weaving a safety net of shared understanding across thousands of kilometers. But the relationship between sapiens and the other human species was not purely competitive. There were moments of curiosity, cooperation, perhaps even tenderness. Interbreeding is the proof. These unions were rare, but they shaped our immunity, our metabolism, and possibly our capacity to thrive in high altitudes or cold climates. The last echoes of Neanderthals and Denisovans were not erased. They were folded into us, absorbed into a species whose population was still dangerously small. Yet something else lingered beneath these exchanges: asymmetry. Where sapiens encountered Neanderthals, the archaeological record shows that Neanderthal populations dwindled afterward. Not instantly, not violently, but steadily. Their tools remained largely unchanged. Their territories shrank. Their bones grew fewer. Meanwhile, sapiens moved steadily outward, their innovations multiplying with each migration. Was it competition? Disease? Climate instability hitting some species harder than others? Perhaps all of these, intertwined. But one theory stands out, not violent, not dramatic, but quietly devastating. Energy efficiency. Sapiens, with their more gracile bodies, required fewer calories to survive. They could endure longer periods of scarcity. Neanderthals, powerful and muscular, needed far more energy simply to maintain their bodies. In an ice-aged world of diminishing resources, this difference may have determined which species could survive lean times and which could not. And so, in cave after cave, valley after valley, the lights of other human species went out. A Neanderthal child playing beside a dying fire. A Denisovan elder watching the mountains shift with the seasons. A Floresiensis hunter weaving through forest shadows. Their worlds grew smaller, until there was no world left for them at all. Meanwhile, sapiens continued forward, not because they were destined, but because they were adaptable enough to remain. We are the ghosts of all who came before, carrying in ourselves the fragments of their final struggles. Their disappearance is not a triumph. It is an inheritance, and the weight of that inheritance still follows us, whispering through the deep corridors of our past that survival was never guaranteed, and may never be again. Long before humans rose to dominate the food chain, they lived in a world that viewed them not as conquerors, but as opportunities. Small, slow, oddly fragile creatures wandering through landscapes patrolled by beasts of terrifying power. To survive in such a world was not an act of strength, but a continuous negotiation with fear itself. The earth, then, was filled with predators whose very names now sound like myths. Towering hyenas with jaws strong enough to crack elephant bones, saber-toothed cats whose fangs could pierce thick hides, giant lions, larger than any lion alive today, and packs of wolves far more coordinated than modern descendants. These creatures ruled the plains, forests, and mountains long before humans dared to step into their territories. To them, humans were not mysterious beings with fire and tools. They were meat, walking calories wrapped in thin skin and fear. Imagine the dusk on a prehistoric savanna, the sun sinking in a haze of dust, the air cooling, shadows lengthening. To humans, it was the most dangerous hour. Predators preferred twilight, the moment when their eyes gained power and human vision faltered. A rustle in the tall grass could mean a stalking cat. A distant shape against the horizon could be a hyena clan forming its slow, calculated approach. Human senses were inadequate against such threats. Their smell was poor, their claws non-existent, their teeth unimpressive, their muscles too slow to outrun four-legged hunters. Survival depended not on natural weapons, but on awareness, an instinctive vigilance that became etched into the nervous system of the species. Even today, the human brain is tuned to detect patterns in darkness, to fear sudden movement at the edge of sight, to wake at faint sounds. These instincts are not relics, they are memories. In the earliest periods, humans lacked long-range weapons. They carried stones, sticks, crude hand axes. Against a charging lion, such tools were pathetic. The archaeological record is blunt. Countless early human bones bear punctures, claw marks, fractures, the unmistakable signatures of predator attacks. These fossils tell a grim truth. Humans were hunted regularly. Predators did not fear humans. Humans feared everything. Shelters offered little protection. Caves, dark and seemingly safe, were often already claimed by larger beasts. A misjudged entrance, a moment of carelessness, could lead to an entire group being slaughtered. Some caves show layers of alternating occupation, humans using a space, then predators reclaiming it, then humans again, all separated by ash, bones, and time. Territory belonged to no one. It was borrowed, contested, or stolen. Night was the true enemy. Without fire, humans became nearly blind. Their hearing sharpened, but even that was inadequate against the silent padding of a stalking cat. Some nights, the only defense was clustering together, dozens huddled in a trembling circle, listening, waiting, hoping the darkness passed without incident. Fear was not a temporary feeling. It was a landscape they inhabited. And yet, in this world of claws and teeth, humans began to shift the balance, not through strength, but through pattern recognition. They observed predator behavior, how lions circled their prey, how hyenas tested defenses, how wolves coordinated attacks. Humans noticed details other creatures ignored: the position of tracks, the freshness of scat, the direction of flattened grass. They learned to sense danger before it arrived. Fear sharpened intelligence. From this fear emerged the first strategies: choosing high ground for camps, stationing guards, using stones arranged in rings as crude warning barriers, maintaining fire through the night, even at great cost. Fire itself became a turning point. It glowed, it crackled, it pushed back the dark. Predators hesitated before approaching a flame, confused by its flicker, unsure of its heat. For the first time, humans held something the great beasts did not understand. But even fire was unreliable. Some predators learned to tolerate it. Others waited until flames weakened. A sudden gust of wind, a missed branch, a moment of exhaustion, and the fire would die. Then the night reclaimed its dominion, and the old terror returned. Still, each generation learned more. Each failed defense became a lesson. Each narrow escape carved knowledge deeper into collective memory. In a world determined to devour them, humans became students of danger, apprentices of survival, creatures defined not by their weakness, but by their refusal to be consumed. They were not yet masters of the earth, but they were beginning to understand it, and that understanding would change everything. In a world ruled by predators, humans had two choices: adapt or vanish. Nature offered them no claws, no armored hide, no powerful jaws. What it offered instead was far more subtle, an ability to transform fear into strategy, and strategy into invention. It was in this crucible of constant danger that the first true weapons emerged, not as tools of domination, but as desperate acts of survival. The earliest weapons were crude stones shaped by instinct, but instinct gave way to understanding. Humans realized that a sharpened edge could slice more cleanly, that a pointed tip could penetrate thick fur, that weight distributed correctly could turn a simple rock into a projectile. With each discovery, they stepped one breath further away from helplessness. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything: distance. For millions of years, predators held the advantage because they controlled the range of combat. A lion needed only a heartbeat to close the gap. A wolf pack needed only a moment of distraction. But when humans learned to throw, the deceptively simple ability few animals truly master, the battlefield shifted. A thrown spear or stone was no longer just a weapon. It was a message. You no longer have to reach me to die. Studies of ancient shoulder bones show adaptations unique to humans, structures built to store elastic energy and release it explosively in a throw. This was not an accidental trait. It was shaped by generations who lived long enough to reproduce precisely because they could strike from afar. Suddenly, predators hesitated. A cautious step replaced a confident charge. The calculus of danger changed. Humans learned to exploit this hesitation. They created spears balanced for flight, weighted stones that spun through the air, slings capable of sending projectiles with lethal force. Fire-hardened tips became stone-tipped weapons, which evolved into multi-part tools held together with resin, sinew, and imagination. Still, weapons alone did not elevate humans. Coordination did. A single hunter with a spear could wound a predator. A coordinated group could kill one. Imagine the scene: a pride of cave lions circling a human camp expecting easy prey. But instead of scattering, the humans stand firm, 5, 10, perhaps more, spears raised, fire burning bright. One steps forward to throw. Another circles to flank. Their voices shout warnings, rhythmically, strategically. For the first time in evolutionary history, a predator encounters prey that behaves like a unified organism. This cooperation was the quiet revolution of humanity. Predators began avoiding large human groups. Scavenging became harder for hyenas as humans defended carcasses. A wounded lion was no longer a rare event. It became a warning etched into the memories of entire ecosystems. But this newfound power brought new risks. Emboldened humans could misjudge distances. Spears could miss. A moment of overconfidence could turn triumph into tragedy. Archaeologists find bones from this era with healed fractures, shattered ribs, crushed skulls, the marks of close encounters with beasts. Humans were learning their limits through pain, one generation at a time. Over time, something profound changed within the human mind. Fear didn't vanish. Fear evolved. It became anticipation rather than paralysis, a guide instead of a jailer, a lens through which danger could be studied, understood, and eventually mastered. This emotional transformation had cognitive consequences. Humans developed the ability to imagine threats not yet present, to rehearse actions mentally, to pass down knowledge through stories and warnings. Around campfires, elders recounted hunts with details as sharp as the weapons they carried: where to stand, when to throw, how a predator thinks. These stories were not entertainment. They were survival algorithms wrapped in narrative form. Through this cultural transmission, a new kind of intelligence emerged, one not written in genes, but in memory and imagination. Every generation stood on the shoulders of the last, inheriting not only tools, but insights. Gradually, painfully, humans crossed a threshold invisible at the time. They became predators in their own right. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but the most strategic, the the most adaptable, and the first species to bend the behavior of other predators without being stronger than them. On ancient plains once ruled by claws and fangs, a new kind of hunter walked, fragile in body, relentless in mind. Long after humanity learned to fend off predators and wield weapons with growing mastery, a far more ancient enemy tightened its grip around their lives: hunger. Unlike lions or wolves, hunger had no shape, no sound, no warning growl in the night. It crept in slowly, quietly, weaving itself into the rhythm of existence until it became a constant presence, a second shadow trailing every step. For early humans, scarcity was not an occasional crisis. It was the structure of their world. Seasons dictated survival with cold precision. In the brief warmth of summer, berries ripened, animals grew fat, fish swam closer to shore. But humans did not yet understand how to preserve abundance. When winter returned, and winter always returned, food vanished with ruthless efficiency. Plants shriveled, animals migrated or died, rivers froze or thinned. A band that feasted in one season could find itself starving in the next. The human body adapted to this cycle in ways both miraculous and brutal. Layers of fat stored precious calories. Metabolisms slowed in times of need. But biology could only compensate so much. Starvation marked bones with unmistakable signatures: porous surfaces, stunted growth, fragile rib cages. Fossils from this era speak of repeated famine, of children who never reached full size, of adults whose bodies bore the scars of lifelong deprivation. And hunger shaped behavior more powerfully than fear ever had. Groups traveled enormous distances in search of food, following migrating herds with stubborn determination. Some crossed mountains, others traversed deserts, driven not by exploration, but by necessity. The migration routes that would one day define the spread of humanity often began simply as desperate searches for calories. Hunger also rewired social dynamics. Those who found food shared it not out of generosity, but out of strategy. A well-fed member of the group could hunt the next day. A starving member slowed everyone down. Food was power, and those who controlled it, skilled hunters, keen gatherers, elders with memory of fruitful regions, held influence long before the concept of leadership existed. But hunger could also fracture bonds. Anthropologists have found signs of abandoned camps, hints of conflict over resources, and evidence that some groups split apart when food became scarce. Scarcity pressured the human spirit until it revealed both its brightest and darkest corners. And then there was the silent killer that stalked alongside hunger: malnutrition. It weakened immune systems, making even minor infections lethal. It damaged cognitive development, leaving generations with fewer mental tools to adapt. It caused anemia, dizziness, slow reactions, dangerous in a world where predators still watched from the edges of campfires. Malnutrition turned strong hunters into fragile figures trembling in the cold, their bodies unable to rebuild muscle or recover from injury. Yet through this suffering, humans discover something extraordinary: the ability to extract survival from environments that offered almost nothing. They learned which roots remained edible even in drought, which insects carried the most nutrition, where to find edible bark, how to break open bones to reach the calorie-rich marrow inside. These were not small insights. They were lifelines. A single discovery could mean the difference between extinction and endurance. Some groups learned to track animal migrations with astonishing accuracy, predicting movements based on wind direction, temperature shifts, or subtle changes in vegetation. Others became masters of opportunistic hunting, scavenging carcasses left behind by stronger predators and using tools to access what teeth and claws could not. But perhaps the most transformative adaptation was this: humans began to understand the value of planning beyond the present. They cached food in hidden pits. They dried meat in smoke. They stored berries in woven containers sealed with resin. They built the earliest forms of seasonal camps, strategic positions where food was more likely to be found. These acts marked the beginning of something that would eventually reshape the planet. The idea that humans could shape their own food supply instead of being controlled by it. But that revolution was still far away. For now, hunger remained the great sculptor of humanity, carving bone, shaping instinct, driving exploration, sharpening intelligence, and teaching again and again that survival came not to the strongest, but to those who could outthink starvation itself. In the harsh eras before civilization, hunger was not a visitor. It was home. For countless generations, hunger dictated the boundaries of human survival. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. It began with observation, simple, accidental. A seed dropped near a camp one season sprouted the next. A patch of disturbed soil bore more grain than the wild meadows nearby. Tubers replanted by chance grew thicker and sweeter. At first, these discoveries seemed like luck, but humanity had learned to recognize patterns even in desperation. What followed was not an invention, but an awakening. The earliest attempts to shape the land were crude, scratching soil with sticks, scattering seeds without understanding seasons, watering plants only when rivers swelled. Yet even these primitive efforts produced a small miracle: predictability. For the first time in the long history of struggle, humans could influence where food came from. It was a revolution so subtle that those who lived through it did not grasp its magnitude. They only knew that for once, the world seemed less hostile. But nature does not grant gifts without cost. The shift from foraging to cultivation reshaped the human body in ways both profound and punishing. Farming demanded labor, bending, kneeling, carrying, cutting, grinding. Bones from the earliest agricultural communities show stress fractures, damaged spines, worn joints. Teeth deteriorated rapidly as diets shifted from varied proteins to grain-heavy meals filled with stone dust from grinding tools. And diseases flourished. Settlements meant human waste accumulated, water sources became contaminated, rodents and insects thrived in stored grain. With more people living closer together, pathogens spread faster than ever before. The irony was brutal. In seeking stability, humans had created conditions for sickness on a scale the hunter-gatherer world had rarely known. Even nutrition declined. Foragers had eaten diverse diets: meat, plants, roots, insects, nuts. Early farmers relied heavily on a single crop: wheat, barley, rice, millet, maize. Monotony replaced abundance. Bodies weakened. Height decreased. Life expectancy often fell. Yet farming offered something no other lifestyle ever had: a reliable surplus. Even a modest harvest could feed more mouths than a successful hunt. More food meant larger families. Larger families meant growing communities. Growing communities meant more ideas, more cooperation, more collective memory. But the true engine behind the agricultural shift was not abundance. It was cycle. Plant. Wait. Harvest. Store. The seasons became a rhythm humans could predict and depend on. For the first time, the future seemed like something that could be shaped rather than feared. But predictability came with new chains. Settled life tied humans to a specific plot of land. If crops failed, they could not simply migrate. They had invested too much: shelters, fields, storage pits, rituals. Land ownership emerged. Territory disputes followed. With surpluses worth stealing, conflict sharpened. Violence became systematic rather than opportunistic. Agriculture had not solved hunger, it had reorganized it. Now famine came not from scarcity of wild food, but from crop failure. A single drought, a single swarm of locusts, a single flood could starve thousands instead of dozens. Still, humans embraced farming not because it made life easier, but because it made life predictable enough to allow something extraordinary. The birth of culture at a scale never before imagined. Music, rituals, permanent shelters, shared myths. The first hints of civilization flickered like firelight behind the walls of early villages. And though disease spread, though bodies weakened, though societies grew divided, humans would never again abandon their new pact with the soil. The sweet promise of agriculture carried within it a long, slow curse. But it also carried the seeds of every story humanity would someday tell. Long before the first cities rose, long before writing etched memory into clay, an older and far more silent force ruled the destiny of humanity: disease. Unlike predators, sickness made no sound in the night. It left no tracks to follow, no shadows to fear at the edge of firelight. It moved invisibly, drifting through water, soil, air, skin, blood. It hunted with a patience that no living creature could match. Even when humans believed they had finally subdued the natural world, fended off beasts, mastered fire, tamed the land, disease reminded them that the true battlefield was not outside, but within. In the earliest humans, sickness manifested in ways we now recognize only through the mute testimony of ancient bones. Some skulls show pocked lesions from bacterial infection. Vertebrae fused together under the relentless march of tuberculosis. Children's bones reveal halted growth, sudden fevers, malnutrition-driven immune collapse. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the structure of prehistoric life. Hunter-gatherers had faced illness as scattered sparks, here and there, contained by distance and mobility. But as humans gathered in larger groups, sharing water sources, soil, tools, meat, and air, those sparks found fuel. Disease spread in waves. It flowed through tribes like a cold shadow, leaving behind weakened limbs, trembling hands, coughing elders, and infants who failed to wake. Without understanding germs, humans knew sickness as a spirit, a curse, a punishment. They feared it more than predators because predators killed the unlucky few. Disease killed the many. In early settlements, the danger intensified. Stagnant water pooled in shallow pits. Food waste attracted insects that carried parasites. Close living quarters meant that a simple cough could travel through a community in hours. Pathogens that had once perished in the wild now thrived in the warmth of human proximity. Imagine an early village at dusk, smoke rising from cooking fires, grain drying in woven baskets, children playing in the dirt, animals grazing near huts. Hidden in this scene, within the dust, the water, the bodies, were countless microscopic threats evolving faster than humans could comprehend. Malaria lurked in swamps. Dysentery seeped into drinking pools. Parasites drilled into skin and settled in muscle. Viruses hopped between individuals with ruthless efficiency. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that early humans could do to stop it. Many diseases left no visible mark on bone, meaning the true scope of ancient suffering is lost to time. Entire generations might have been shaped by recurring epidemics we will never identify. Natural selection, harsh and indifferent, carved away those who lacked resilient immune systems. The survivors, our ancestors, carried within them invisible gifts forged by survival through repeated biological war. But these gifts came with a price. Humanity became intertwined with disease in a constant evolutionary arms race. As humans developed immunity, pathogens evolved new strategies. As humans adapted behaviors to avoid contamination, microbes adapted to exploit new weaknesses. It was, and still is, a war without truce. Sickness shaped migration. It shaped family structures. It shaped superstition and ritual. It shaped fear itself. In some ancient burials, bodies lie curled tightly as though death arrived suddenly. In others, graves contain multiple individuals who died within days of each other, a silent record of outbreaks that swept communities away before memory could even form. Yet the most haunting truth is this: humanity's greatest advances often worsened disease. Fire kept predators away but drew groups together. Shelters protected from weather but trapped air. Farming increased food supply but brought rodents and insects in close proximity. Permanent villages allowed culture to flourish but gave pathogens a stable home. Every step forward carried the invisible footprints of microbes evolving alongside us. In the great ledger of prehistory, disease killed far more humans than cold, hunger, or beasts. But in doing so, it also shaped who we became. Immunity, genetic diversity, stress responses, even human social behavior were molded in the crucible of repeated sickness. And the worst was yet to come. Because the day humans learned to gather in true settlements, the day civilization began, was the day disease gained its most powerful ally: crowds. As human communities grew, sickness no longer visited them as isolated storms. It became a season, a cycle, an expectation. The invisible enemies that once drifted through forests and rivers now lived among them, adapting, multiplying, codifying themselves into the very fabric of human existence. If hunger sculpted bones and fear sharpened the mind, disease reshaped humanity at the deepest level, in blood, in genes, in the inherited maps of the immune system. Every child born into early settlements entered a world of unseen battles. Some fell ill within weeks, their bodies too fragile to withstand the microbes swirling in contaminated air and water. Others survived the first wave, only to face a second or a third. Those who lived long enough to reach adulthood were rare, and they became the genetic conduits through which humanity learned to resist its microscopic predators. Evolution played out ruthlessly in these ancient villages. A single mutation, one tiny alteration in the script of DNA, could mean the difference between surviving an outbreak or becoming another unmarked grave in the packed earth outside the settlement walls. Over generations, the survivors accumulated layers of inherited resistance. Immunity became a biological story passed down like a memory etched into flesh. Yet immunity was never perfect. Microbes evolved faster than humans did. Viruses learned to spread before symptoms appeared. Bacteria developed ways to evade early immune defenses. Parasites infiltrated organs, hiding where the body could not reach them. In this escalating arms race, humanity endured not through strength, but through variability. A diverse gene pool meant disease could not wipe everyone out in a single sweep. Some would fall, others would survive, and survival itself became the sculptor of future generations. But the cost was immense. Archaeological sites reveal entire clusters of burials, families, villages, sometimes entire communities struck down within a short span. Bones show signs of chronic infections that lasted months or years, twisting spines, eroding joints, hollowing out ribs. These people lived in constant dialogue with pain. Their bodies bore the signatures of pathogens that modern science is still unraveling. And yet, disease did more than kill. It changed how humans thought, behaved, believed, and feared. Rituals emerged from epidemics. Communities began to assign supernatural meaning to sickness. Some illnesses were blamed on spirits, curses, or displeased ancestors. Others led to the first attempts at quarantine, primitive but instinctive. Mothers kept sick children separate. Hunters avoided drinking from stagnant pools. Elders cautioned against strangers entering the village during certain seasons. These behaviors were not yet science, but they were survival strategies refined by generations of desperate observation. Disease also reshaped human cooperation. Groups that cared for their sick, bringing water, sharing food, cleaning wounds, had higher survival rates than those that abandoned them. Empathy, though costly, became advantageous. A community with even a few recovered immune individuals gained defenders against future outbreaks. What seemed like kindness was, at its core, a powerful evolutionary adaptation. The immune system itself evolved with startling creativity. Cells learned to remember pathogens. Proteins adapted to neutralize invaders faster. Bodies developed fevers not as signs of weakness, but as weapons, raising internal temperatures to levels deadly for microbes but survivable for humans. Pain, too, became a warning rather than a punishment, an internal alarm system honed by millennia of suffering. But while immunity strengthened, disease strengthened faster. As populations increased, pathogens found endless new hosts. Some ancient microbes became so efficient at infecting humans that they remain with us today, unchanged across thousands of years. Others died out once their hosts developed resistance, leaving behind only whispers in fossilized skeletal lesions. This interplay, attack, defense, counterattack, defined human prehistory as much as migration, hunting, or climate did. Life expectancy remained painfully short. Childhood was a battlefield of invisible threats. And yet, across continents, humanity persisted. What emerged from this crucible was a species whose resilience was not measured by muscle or bone, but by its ability to survive the endless chemical and biological storms raging within. Disease did not merely threaten humanity, it forged humanity. In our immune cells lie the memories of ancient epidemics. In our genes lie the signatures of plagues that nearly ended us. And in our behavior lie instincts shaped by thousands of years spent fighting enemies too small to see. We are the descendants of those who survived, not because they were stronger, but because they endured enough suffering for evolution to notice. Long before empires rose and armies marched, before kings carved borders into the earth, conflict already pulsed through the veins of humanity. It did not begin with ambition or conquest. It began with scarcity, with hunger, with fear, with the fragile understanding that resources were limited and life fragile. As human groups grew larger and settlements more permanent, the world that once seemed vast suddenly felt too small. The first wars were not battles between nations. They were struggles between neighbors. Imagine a green valley during a brief, generous season. A stream, a patch of fertile soil, a herd's migration route. Tiny oases of life in a harsh world. To one group, these were blessings. To another, promises. To both, they were survival. And when two human bands reached for the same lifeline, conflict became inevitable. Archaeology provides unsettling evidence. Skeletons from ancient lakesides, riverbanks, and early settlements bear signs of violence that cannot be dismissed as accidents. Skulls crushed by blunt weapons, ribs pierced by stone-tipped spears, arrowheads still embedded in bone. Entire groups appear to have died together, bodies left where they fell. These silent testimonies reveal a truth often ignored. Humanity learned to kill its own kind early, long before civilization sharpened its tools. But why did humans begin attacking one another? The answer lies in the combination of traits that made us successful: intelligence, cooperation, and territoriality. Cooperation bound groups tightly, turning them into units that fought not only to protect individuals but to protect shared memory, shared food, shared hope. Intelligence allowed them to strategize, to ambush, to plan. Territoriality turned land into identity, water into inheritance, and food into a resource worth dying for. Conflict was not constant. It ebbed and flowed with the seasons. During times of abundance, groups coexisted, trading tools, stories, or rituals. But when drought struck, when winter lingered too long, when sickness thinned herds or spoiled crops, suspicion fermented in the mind as easily as fear. And fear is the oldest architect of violence. A footprint near a camp, a hunting ground that suddenly lacked prey, a distant torchlight at night. Even the rumor of another group approaching could fracture the fragile peace. Humans began developing behaviors recognizable today: guarding territory boundaries, sending scouts to observe rivals, forming alliances between families or clans. These social structures grew not from malice but from necessity. In a world with no laws but survival, trust had limits, and threats, once identified, had to be dealt with swiftly. Weapons evolved accordingly. The same spear crafted to hunt deer became a tool for fighting humans. Stone knives, shaped for processing hides, became instruments of war. Clubs emerged, simple, brutal, efficient. Later came bows, the first machines designed not merely to kill, but to kill from safety. But the true shift was not technological, it was psychological. For the first time, humans began to perceive other humans not as potential allies or trading partners, but as obstacles, as competitors, as existential risks. This shift was subtle, yet seismic. Once a group learned it could eliminate rivals to secure resources, warfare became a strategy, a grim extension of survival logic. And yet, violence was not mindless. Humans showed restraint where predators would not. Raids focused on territory or resources, not extermination. Captives were sometimes absorbed into victorious groups, strengthening gene flow and cultural diversity. This adaptability prevented early warfare from destroying humanity outright. Instead, war became another landscape humans learned to navigate. On plains now quiet beneath the weight of time, the first ambushes unfolded. Hunters lay in wait not for animals, but for each other. A shouted warning broke the dawn, a spear cast not for survival, but for dominance. A wound inflicted not by beast, but by human will. War had begun, not as a clash of empires, but as the moment humanity realized it could shape its world with violence as easily as with cooperation. It was one more step toward becoming the most dangerous species ever to walk the earth. The earliest human conflicts were messy, impulsive, born of fear and chance. But something changed as generations passed. Violence, once chaotic and instinctive, began to acquire structure. Humans discovered that harm could be planned, not merely reacted to, that an enemy could be weakened before being seen, that danger could be shaped rather than endured. This realization transformed conflict from a desperate scramble into a deliberate act. The shift began with technology. A stone sharpened on one edge became a cutting blade. Sharpen it on two edges, now it was a weapon. Attach it to a long shaft, now it offered range. Fire harden the wood, now it carried durability. Bind stone to bone with sinew, now it had permanence. Every improvement solved a problem. Every improvement created a new possibility. The invention of the spear thrower, for example, extended a human's reach far beyond the constraints of muscle. A small tool held in the hand suddenly allowed hunters and warriors to hurl spears with greater speed and force than the human body alone could produce. It widened the gap between life and death in ways predators could not anticipate. But the true revolution arrived with the bow. The first bows were simple arcs of wood strung with animal sinew, but they represented something profound: the weaponized use of energy stored over time. Now a human could kill silently, from hiding, at distances that made retaliation nearly impossible. Predators had never possessed such a tool. Even Neanderthals had never fully mastered it. This was a uniquely sapiens invention, an extension of the mind more than the hand. With ranged weapons, conflict evolved. Ambushes became more devastating. Defending territory became more complex. A dispute over water or grazing land, once settled with shouts or shoves, now carried the potential for bloodshed from the margin of a forest, from behind a boulder, from beyond sight entirely. But technology alone does not create war. Intention does. Humans began to understand that an enemy weakened early meant fewer casualties later. Raids became preemptive. Attacks targeted food storage, tools, even shelters before a battle began. A group would strike swiftly under cover of darkness, not to annihilate rivals, but to cripple their capacity to survive winter. These were not armies. These were families, clans, bands of a few dozen at most, yet their strategies foreshadowed tactics used thousands of years later. Conflict also reshaped the human mind. Anthropologists believe that traits like anxiety, vigilance, loyalty, and suspicion were sharpened by evolution during this era. Groups that remained alert endured. Groups that trusted too easily vanished. Warfare demanded cooperation just as hunting did, and those who coordinated best lived longest. A strange paradox emerged. Violence strengthened social bonds. A group that fought together survived together. A group that survived together passed on their genes. Solidarity was no longer just emotional, it was biological. Archaeological evidence shows that some groups even developed rudimentary forms of leadership, individuals who coordinated raids, negotiated alliances, and settled internal disputes. Authority did not yet come from wealth, for wealth did not exist. It came from experience, from reputation, from the ability to read danger like scripture carved into the land. But the consequences of conflict were immense. Some valleys that once hosted thriving communities became graveyards. Some rivers, once shared peacefully, turned into boundaries of death. Some migrations ended abruptly beneath a volley of arrows. Yet through this violence, humanity unknowingly laid the foundations of future civilizations. Weapons demanded craftsmanship. Conflict demanded organization. Defense demanded planning. Planning demanded communication. Communication demanded memory. War forced humans to imagine the future, not only their own, but their enemies as well. This ability to model another mind, to anticipate actions, to calculate risk, became an essential tool in human cognition. It was as if the crucible of conflict accelerated the development of abstract thought. The mind evolved not only to survive predators, but to navigate the infinitely more complex threat of other humans. And so, in the deep past, long before written words or metal blades, humans discovered a truth both terrifying and transformative. The most dangerous predator they would ever face was themselves. Long before the great empires carved their names into stone, humanity experienced a quieter, more delicate revolution, the birth of the first civilizations. They rose in river valleys where soil was rich, water predictable, and harvests generous. For the first time in history, humans could imagine a world not defined solely by wandering, hunger, or fear. Villages grew into towns. towns into cities, cities into symbols of something breathtakingly new, organized human ambition. But this rise was not triumphant. It was precarious. These early civilizations, Sumer in Mesopotamia, the kingdoms of the Nile, the mysterious Indus Valley, were biological and environmental experiments balanced on the edge of chaos. Everything about them was new: the density of people, the scale of agriculture, the complexity of social systems, and everything could collapse with alarming ease. Consider Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. Its rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, brought life-giving water but also unpredictable floods that could destroy entire harvests overnight. The land was fertile, yes, but fragile. A shift in river course, a single drought year, a swarm of pests, any one of these could unravel the delicate fabric of society. Now imagine people living in mud brick houses clustered together, breathing the same air, drinking from the same wells, touching the same tools. Pathogens that once died in the wild found ideal conditions in the crowded streets of Uruk or Eridu. Diseases that had once burned out in small tribes now swept through populations like wildfire. A cough, a rash, a fever became public crises. And still, cities grew. Humans planted fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. They built granaries, temples, irrigation canals, webs of technology that allowed thousands of people to depend on a single harvest, a single river, a single climate. This dependence was both miracle and curse. It replaced the unpredictability of nature with the unpredictability of human error. One mismanaged canal could dry out a region. One poor harvest could starve thousands. One internal dispute could fracture a kingdom. Civilization was not stability. Civilization was concentration of people, resources, risks. In Egypt, the Nile's annual flood determined everything. A high flood meant abundance. A low flood meant famine. The rhythm of the river was sacred because it was survival itself. But when that rhythm faltered, when rains failed in distant highlands or shifts in climate disrupted the cycle, the great temples and monuments offered no protection. A drought was not merely an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of urban planning. Straight streets, drainage systems, standardized weights. They seemed to embody the triumph of order over chaos. Yet their civilization too flickered and vanished, not with war, not with fire, but with silence. Rivers shifted, crops faltered, trade routes dissolved, and the people disappeared into history, leaving behind baked bricks and unanswered questions. All these early civilizations shared one truth. They were powerful, but not resilient. Their strength came from concentration, and concentration made them vulnerable. The larger the community, the farther the fall when disaster struck. And disaster always struck. Floods, droughts, epidemics, social unrest, each pressure built upon the last. In times of plenty, cities thrived. In times of scarcity, they cracked from within. Famine bred anger, inequality sharpened conflict. Leaders claimed divine right to rule until their people no longer believed them. Entire kingdoms imploded, not from external invasion, but from the slow, grinding weight of internal strain. The dawn of civilization was not a peaceful sunrise. It was a fragile glow trembling at the edge of darkness, a reminder that no matter how many walls humans built, the world could unmake them in an instant. As early civilizations flourished, their achievements shimmered like fragile constellations over a dark sea of uncertainty. Irrigation canals glittered under the sun, granaries brimmed with grain, markets buzzed with trade. But beneath this veneer of progress lurked a truth woven into the very structure of early societies. The higher humans built, the harder they fell. And fall they did, again and again. The mechanisms of collapse were varied, but their outcome was always the same: silence swallowing cities that once teemed with life. Start with climate, the oldest and most indifferent destroyer of civilizations. In Mesopotamia, the rivers that had sustained life for millennia began to betray their people. Shifts in rainfall patterns far beyond human sight dried the Euphrates, leaving irrigation canals cracked and empty. Salt accumulated in overused fields, poisoning the soil. Harvest after harvest failed. Villages were abandoned. Temples lost their offerings. The great cities of Sumer, once cradles of innovation, began to hollow out from the inside. In Egypt, a series of unusually low Nile floods triggered cascading disaster. Without the annual inundation, fields turned barren, grain stores dwindled, famine spread across the land. As people starved, faith faltered. Pharaohs, once believed to be gods in human form, were blamed for the river's silence. Rebellions ignited in the shadows of monuments. The Old Kingdom, a civilization that had seemed unshakable, fractured. Further east, in the mysterious Indus Valley, a slow catastrophe unfolded. Rivers changed course, perhaps triggered by distant tectonic shifts or long-term climate patterns. Without water, the cities, meticulously planned, astonishingly advanced, lost their lifeblood. Fields dried. Trade networks dissolved. People drifted away until only the shells of cities remained, baked brick testimony to a society undone not by war, but by the earth itself shifting beneath their feet. The climate was only one of the executioners. Disease thrived in early civilizations. Dense populations offered a paradise for pathogens. A single contaminated water source could ripple outward into thousands of deaths. Trade routes, once celebrated as channels of prosperity, doubled as highways of infection. Illness moved with traders, soldiers, and migrants, striking cities unprepared to understand, let alone stop, the spread of invisible killers. And then there was conflict. As societies grew richer, they became targets. Armies sharpened their weapons. Fortifications rose. The earliest recorded wars were not chaotic skirmishes, but organized campaigns, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. Drought-stricken regions invaded fertile ones. Desperate people raided grain stores. Leaders, threatened by famine and unrest, launched wars to preserve power or distract their suffering populations. Every civilization believed itself destined to endure. None understood how fragile destiny could be. Some fell quickly, in flames and slaughter. Others died slowly, hollowed out by hunger, disease, and despair. Still others declined so gradually that generations lived through the collapse without realizing the world they knew was ending. But perhaps the most haunting collapses were the ones that left no clear cause at all. Archaeologists walking through ancient ruins sometimes find no signs of fire, no evidence of violent conquest, no mass graves, just emptiness. Doors left open, tools abandoned, walls eroded by time, as if the people simply walked away and never returned. What could drive entire populations to vanish so quietly? Environmental exhaustion? Social breakdown? A spiritual crisis? A disease we no longer have the tools to detect? The answers remain buried, scattered in clues too faint to reconstruct with certainty. Yet one truth transcends all theories. Early civilizations did not fall because humans were weak. They fell Because they were ambitious, and ambition tied them to complex systems that cracked under pressure. Cities amplified every vulnerability. One failed harvest, one contaminated well, one misguided leader, one shift in climate. Civilization gave humanity unprecedented power, but it also gave collapse unprecedented scale. And in the ruins of these fallen worlds, future generations learned a lesson that echoes across millennia. The Earth does not care how high we build. It can unmake everything in a single, indifferent breath. While civilizations rose and fell, while wars were waged and rivers changed course, ordinary humans lived lives far removed from the grand narratives carved into monuments. Their world was not one of kings or priests or towering cities. It was a world of hunger, toil, sickness, and fear. An existence so harsh that if a modern person were forced to endure it, they would likely perish within days. For most of human history, life was short, not metaphorically, brutally, statistically short. Infant mortality hovered around levels that would horrify modern doctors. In many communities, half of all children never reached adolescence. Those who survived carried the marks of struggle etched into their bones: stunted growth from malnutrition, warped spines from labor, healed fractures from accidents and violence. Even the luckiest among them rarely lived beyond 40. Old age was not a stage of life, it was a miracle. Daily life was an unending negotiation with exhaustion. At dawn, bodies already aching from the previous day's labor rose again to gather firewood, fetch water, tend crops, chase animals, mend tools, or carry out whatever work the season demanded. Every task was physical. Every mistake was dangerous. A fall, a deep cut, an infection, each could spiral into death within days. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals, no doctors in the modern sense. Pain was not an emergency. It was a constant companion. And hunger always returned. Even in settled farming communities, famine lurked like a wolf at the door. A dry season, an infestation, a failed harvest, these could send families into spirals of desperation. Children with swollen bellies from protein deficiency, adults gaunt from months of rationing, elders quietly fading as the younger generations hoarded calories for survival. Hunger shaped every decision: when to plant, when to migrate, how much food to store, who received the last scraps when winter stretched too long. Disease, too, was ever present. To wake with a fever was to face the possibility of death. To drink from a contaminated river was to invite parasites that gnawed from within. To live in close quarters with animals meant exposure to pathogens that would one day evolve into humanity's greatest plagues. Archaeologists examining ancient remains often find jawbones riddled with abscesses, teeth worn to nubs from grinding grain between stones, skulls showing signs of chronic sinus infections, bones bearing lesions from tuberculosis or brucellosis. These were not rare conditions. They were the background hum of daily life. And then there was childbirth. For ancient women, childbirth was the most dangerous act they would ever perform. Pelvises too small, infants too large, infections too quick to spread. A staggering number of mothers and babies died during delivery. Entire communities could be devastated by the loss of reproductive age women. The very process that allowed humanity to continue was one of its most lethal. Yet the harshness of life extended beyond the physical. Social structures were rigid. Inequality existed long before kings and empires. In many early societies, the strong exploited the weak, the wealthy hoarded resources, and the poor labored endlessly for scraps. Hierarchies emerged quickly once agriculture created the first surpluses. Those who controlled the land controlled the food. Those who controlled the food controlled everything. And still, In the midst of unrelenting struggle, humans found moments of astonishing resilience. They sang. They carved symbols into bone and stone. They buried their dead with care, leaving behind flowers, tools, beads, and pigments. They told stories as the night settled over them, using words to weave meaning from suffering. These small acts were rebellions against a universe that seemed indifferent to human existence. Life was pain, but life also insisted on beauty. And that insistence, fragile as it was, carried humanity forward through millennia of hardship. Beyond hunger, pain, and disease, there was another realm in which early humans struggled, one invisible to archaeologists, yet written into the architecture of the human mind. A world of emotions shaped by darkness, danger, and uncertainty. It is impossible to understand our ancestors' lives without stepping into this psychological terrain, where fear ruled the night and meaning was carved from silence. Imagine a world without artificial light. Nightfall did not dim the sky, it swallowed it. The stars, beautiful as they were, did little to soften the darkness that pressed against human settlements. In that darkness lived predators, rival groups, spirits, ancestors, and dangers unnamed. Every shadow became a potential threat. Every crack of a twig demanded attention. Even today, remnants of this instinct linger in our jump scares, our goosebumps, our unease in unlit rooms. These are echoes of a time when the darkness was not metaphorical, it was deadly. Fear shaped behavior long before logic did. Fear told humans when to flee, when to defend, when to stay silent. Fear trained generations to become creatures of awareness. But fear was not the only emotion that defined them. There was grief, deep, frequent, unavoidable. Death was so common that ancient humans developed rituals not just to honor the dead, but to manage their own survival. Grief needed structure. Without structure, it overwhelmed. Burials became more than practical necessities. They became expressions of continuity, acknowledging that even in suffering, life must go on. Bodies were placed with tools, pigments, beads, signs of care in a world that afforded little comfort. Love existed too, though it manifested differently than the modern imagination might picture. Love was protection, shared food, warmth beside a fire, a hand held during sickness, a parent's decision to starve so their child might live another day. These acts were quieter than romance, but more profound, for they emerged from desperation rather than abundance. Stress was constant. The fight or flight response activated so often that it became biological inheritance. Humans today still carry the physiological scars of ancient stress, hearts that race at distant sounds, instincts attuned to negativity, minds shaped to scan for danger before safety. Evolution favored those who paid attention to threats, not those who lived in peace. Meanwhile, the unknown loomed everywhere. Without science or writing, humans pieced together explanations for thunder, illness, earthquakes, and dreams from fragments of experience. Myth was not entertainment. It was survival. Stories taught where predators hunted. Stories warned which plants killed. Stories explained seasons, death, and misfortune. Myths distilled generations of hard-earned knowledge into narratives the mind could remember. And in these narratives, humans found meaning in a world that offered none freely. Spirituality emerged from this need to make sense of suffering. Perhaps the spirits of ancestors lingered to protect. Perhaps unseen forces controlled weather and fate. Perhaps rituals could persuade the world to show mercy. These beliefs were not primitive errors. They were psychological tools, defenses against the crushing weight of uncertainty. when a child died, when a hunt failed, when famine struck. Humans sought not just food or safety, but reason. Meaning softened grief. Community softened despair. The earliest evidence of musical instruments, flutes carved from bone, suggests that even in the harshest environments, humans sought beauty. Music became a shared language of emotion, a way to mourn, to celebrate, to anchor minds in something other than fear. Humor, too, emerged as a coping mechanism. A laugh around the fire was not frivolous. It was rebellion against a universe that rarely gave them cause for joy. Through these emotional adaptations, humans became resilient not only in body, but in mind. The harsh world shaped inner lives as profoundly as it shaped bones. The ancient fears, longings, beliefs, and instincts forged during this era still ripple through modern psychology. We fear the dark because they feared predators. We tell stories because they needed meaning. We seek love because they needed protection. We grieve deeply because they learned to endure loss. We dream, hope, doubt, and despair along pathways carved by their experiences. The emotional landscape of early humanity was brutal, yet from that brutality emerged the foundations of every feeling we know today. When we look backward across the immense arc of human history, the modern world feels impossibly bright. Our cities glitter with artificial light that banishes the night. Our shelves overflow with food from every season and every climate. Our lives stretch long beyond what our ancestors could imagine. Pain, hunger, darkness, these things still exist, but they no longer define us. And yet, for 99% of the time humans have walked the earth, suffering was not an interruption of life. It was life. To understand this truth is to hold up a mirror polished by thousands of generations, each layer etched with hardship. The reflection that stares back is not the face of a modern human, confident and sheltered, but a silhouette shaped by 10,000 trials. Volcanic winters, ice ages, predators, famine, disease, and the collapse of civilizations. It is the face of a survivor who should not exist, and yet somehow does. When we trace the path behind us, the milestones are brutal. A world darkened by ash, where the sun vanished and humanity shrank to a few thousand trembling souls. Centuries frozen under glaciers that crushed forests and carved valleys, driving humans into desperate migrations. A planet prowled by beasts for whom early humans were little more than walking prey. Generations marked by hunger so constant it reshaped bones and minds. A ceaseless war against invisible enemies, parasites, bacteria, viruses, that slaughtered far more people than any spear or blade. The rise of farming, a double-edged salvation that brought food security but also disease, inequality, and endless labor. The birth of warfare, turning humans into both victims and architects of violence. The rise and fall of early civilizations that crumbled under their own weight, leaving behind ruins filled with unanswered questions. Every struggle carved deeper grooves into the species. Every near-extinction rewired human resilience. Every disaster left an imprint passed silently from parent to child. We carry these memories not as stories, but as instincts buried within the nervous system. The quickening heartbeat in darkness, the anxiety that whispers of threats unseen, the craving for sugar and fat, echoes of ancient famine, the tribal loyalty and suspicion of outsiders, remnants of early conflict, the immune system that remembers plagues older than recorded history. We are, in many ways, a mosaic of catastrophes endured. And if we had lived in any of those eras, even the best of them, we would likely consider it a nightmare. Life expectancy rarely passed 35. Injury was a death sentence. Childbirth could take both mother and infant. Hunger arrived every year like a season. Fear was not an emotion, but a landscape. And yet, despite all this, humans persisted. They learned to improvise, to observe, to innovate. They learned to recognize patterns in chaos, to extract meaning from suffering, to build communities resilient enough to withstand what individuals could not. They learned to create art in caves while predators roamed outside, to sing while hunger gnawed at their rib cages, to dream of futures brighter than their present reality. What carried humanity through the worst eras was not strength or speed or natural weapons. It was imagination, the ability to envision a world that did not yet exist. A spear thrown not at an animal but at an idea. A shelter built not only to survive but to plan for tomorrow. A story told not to explain the world, but to endure it. Our ancestors lived in misery, but they dreamed in color. And those dreams were the first sparks of civilization. The past was the worst time to be human, but it was also the forge in which humanity was made. And in understanding that, we are forced to confront a question as old as survival itself. If our world today is unimaginably better, what exactly did we inherit from the darkness that shaped us? If the past is a monument to suffering, then the present is a testament to how far we have risen above it. Yet this rise did not happen gently. It was pushed forward by the weight of every hardship, every extinction we narrowly escaped, every wound carved into the species over tens of thousands of years. When we confront the full expanse of human history, a paradox emerges. We live in the best time to be human precisely because our ancestors endured the worst. For the first time, the night is no longer a predator's invitation. We command light with the touch of a fingertip. No lion circles our homes. No hyena shadows our steps. The darkness that terrified our ancestors has become an aesthetic, something we seek for quiet, for beauty, for thought, not something from which we must flee. Hunger, once the constant companion of humanity, has lost much of its power. Food, once scavenged and hunted and fought over, now flows in abundance so great that the modern struggle is not finding enough, but controlling excess. It took humanity tens of thousands of years to achieve what our ancestors could not have imagined: the ability to feed billions. Disease, that ancient, invisible enemy, no longer rules us. Vaccines, antibiotics, sanitation, and medicine have turned death from infection into an event rather than an expectation. We do not bury half our children. We do not fear a fever as a sentence. Life expectancy now stretches far beyond the wildest dreams of the Paleolithic world, reaching ages that, to our ancestors, would have seemed almost divine. Violence, too, has diminished. The world still bleeds, but statistically, historically, undeniably, humans kill each other far less than they once did. Entire continents exist in relative peace. The average person today has a higher chance of dying from old age than from war, starvation, or predation, a reality unprecedented in all of human history. Even the emotional landscape has changed. We have the luxury to pursue joy rather than merely avoid despair. We have the space to grieve in safety rather than in fear. We can love without the threat of immediate loss. We can dream without needing those dreams to be survival strategies. But to appreciate these miracles, we must understand their origins. All that we are today, our intelligence, our instincts, our creativity, our resilience, was shaped in the furnace of ancient suffering. Every comfort we enjoy rests upon a long legacy of endurance. Our ancestors survived ice ages, plagues, famine, predators, war, and the collapse of entire ecosystems. They survived not because they were destined to, but because they refused to disappear. We are the descendants of the stubborn, the adaptable, the lucky, the few who stood at the edge of extinction and stepped back from the brink. And yet, the most astonishing truth is this: the world we inherited is safer, richer, and more predictable than any our species has ever known. But the minds we inherited were sculpted for danger. Inside us still lives the ancient hunter scanning the darkness for threats. Inside us still lives the gatherer storing food just in case. Inside us still lives the mother grieving as if death is always near. Inside us still lives the warrior bracing for conflict. Inside us still lives the storyteller trying to make sense of a world that once made none. We are modern humans carrying Paleolithic emotions, agricultural beliefs, and industrial power, a blend of past and present that explains much of the tension of our age. But understanding this tension gives us something our ancestors never had: the ability to choose. We can choose reason over fear. We can choose cooperation over conflict. We can choose empathy over suspicion. We can choose to build a world where the worst times never return. The story of humanity is not one of straight progress, but of survival through unimaginable adversity. The fact that you exist at all places you at the tip of an unbroken chain of victories won by countless forgotten lives. And so, as the long arc of history bends away from darkness, we can finally answer the question that haunted our species from the beginning. When was the worst time to be human? The answer is simple. It was almost every moment before now. Because today, whatever flaws the world still holds, is the first time in the history of our species that being human is not a daily negotiation with death. Today, humanity does not merely survive, it thrives. And the long night that once threatened our existence has finally begun to lift.